Listen up. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this podcast belong solely to the podcast participants, and not to any participant's employer, organization, committee, or other group or individual. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. You know, for fun. So lighten up and enjoy. Oh, Stomping Jen, here we are again.
Again.
Once again.
Again.
I am very excited.
I am too.
We are going to be talking to a nationally recognized genealogist and genealogist lecturer named Rich Venezia.
He's my birthday twin.
I know all about that. And we're going to ask about that.
Okay.
And some of that ties into this story we're going to be talking about.
I'm excited.
Genealogy and Rich's career. He has a company called, and I love this name, Rich Roots Genealogy.
Yeah.
Right?
Very, very awesome.
But we're going to be talking to him about all of the awesome stuff that he is doing.
Well, let's get to it.
Are we ready?
Yes.
All right.
The Soft Serve Podcast.
Creamy, delicious ideas without the creepy truck. All right,
Yeah, we're supposed to talk
Stomping
now.
Jen. Yes, we are supposed to talk now.
You got a little lost in
I
the
am
buttons.
busy with my levers and my sliders over here.
All the buttons.
Yep.
All the buttons.
Well, let's say hello to Rich Venezia. Hello, Rich.
Howdy. How's it going?
Very good. Thank you for joining us.
Yes.
Now, I did kind of a very broad painting in describing what you do as a nationally recognized genealogist and genealogist lecturer, but I'm sure that's insufficient. So I want to give you an opportunity to tell us what you are and what you're doing in the world. Who you are and what you're doing. Sorry. I'm gonna confess to our listeners. I was beset and bedeviled by lots of technical problems
Right.
before we sat down.
We're going to get
with
over
Rich to
very,
talk,
very quickly.
who has been very gracious and understanding
Yes.
as we get going here this evening. So thank you, Rich. But yeah, so Rich, who are you? What do you do in the world? We definitely we always give our guests an opportunity to kind of make their own pitch about what they're doing out there.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here and to chat and to catch up with you guys. As you mentioned, I am a genealogist and I am a genealogical lecturer as well. So I do a lot of research for private clients about their family histories. I speak at conferences and seminars across the country about genealogical research topics. I'm specifically interested in and specialize in topics related to immigration and especially recent immigration, 20th century immigrants, and all the different types of records they created and record sets in which you might find them to, research your family and find some interesting and surprising details. I also help clients with dual citizenship through their ancestors. So for both Ireland and Italy, I gather the paperwork together and act as kind of a project manager to help assist them in that journey to obtain the proper paperwork necessary to become a dual citizen through their ancestral lineage. And I myself, an Italian citizen, have been since 2015. And I love it. I love the research that I do. I love the clients that I work with. I have had some really great, interesting opportunities over the years to work on television shows. I've led some records advocacy access campaigns and have had a great time in the time since I started working as a freelance professional 6 years ago.
Wow.
That is so exciting. And really quickly, I think there might be some people who are listening to this who may not even know what genealogy is. Could you tell us a little bit about what that field of study is, what that discipline is?
Yeah. So I get that a lot, actually, and it's really fun to see what people confuse it with. I get geology a lot, which is rocks. I've gotten gynecology a couple times, which is not what I do. But so basically, genealogy is the study of one's family history. And it's kind of a very broad topic, I suppose. But really what it boils down to is people wanting to learn more about where they came from. You know, their parents, their parents' parents, their grandparents' parents, their great-great-grandparents. Especially here in the United States, a lot of people are very interested in their immigrant roots. You know, a lot of people identify as a hyphenated American, German American, Italian American, Japanese American. And so, you know, the study of one's genealogy is really looking into that and kind of figuring out how you got to be where you are today through the lens of the journeys of the people that came before you.
Thank you for that explanation. How did you become passionate about genealogy? Is this something you were interested in from a very young age? And I'm really curious about where that spark kind of occurred in your life.
Yeah, so my maternal grandmother, my mom's mom, was really interested in family history. I came to genealogy, I think, in a bit of a different way than a lot of my peers and colleagues, because I grew up going to my grandma's house and looking at photos on the wall and knowing, you know, who her grandparents were and where they came from, you know, specifically where in Italy my grandfather's family was from, for instance. And, you know, I think a lot of other people kind of get into genealogy because they had all these questions, you know, or they had one relative that had a few things because they wanted to really learn more for themselves. And, you know, in my case, my grandma had been researching the family history of our family. It had been really interesting to me. I had been really close to her. And so when she passed away, I took it upon myself to continue the research that she was doing for our family. And that, you know, led to a real deep interest in genealogy and in family history, which then led to the career path that I'm on today.
Cool.
How did your grandmother do a lot of research? Was there had the trail gone cold, and was there something for you to pick up and continue? I'm curious about that. Like, was there?
Yeah, I mean, so my grandma did a lot of collecting of information from various relatives. You know, she got in touch with cousins she hadn't seen since she was a kid, you know, and collected a lot of information from various people. She wrote down stories about, you know, her and her sister's childhood experiences with their grandparents, you know, at least one or two of whom who had been the immigrants from the old country. But I think the thing with genealogy is that there's really always more to find. And so, you know, whereas she'd had been collecting a lot of information from other family members or other relatives at that time, you know, in the very early 2000s, that was really when there was a lot more stuff that was being digitized and made available online on websites like Ancestry or Family Search. And I utilized a lot of the information that my grandmother had started to find and to collect, and then kind of verified that utilizing documents that were then, you know, made available online, which she may herself not have been able to access, or they may not have been there yet, you know, by the time that she passed away.
I know I have thought of genealogy kind of being like a series of records and like direct familial relationships, like birth certificates. I'm interested. Are stories like the kind your grandmother collected, like written and oral stories, are those considered part of like a genealogical record when you're trying to put together somebody's history?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it really depends. Each piece of evidence is different, right? You know, what you get on, you know, a a birth record that some town clerk created is different than what you get in a family Bible that was kept by the family patriarch is different than what you get in these types of things. Or my grandmother actually, wrote down stories that she remembered from her childhood. It can get sometimes difficult because personal recollections don't always necessarily equate to true factual statements, right? Or what they remember may not necessarily be correct, especially in terms of, where exactly people came from in Europe, for instance, or other family details like that. But those stories are definitely more precious and absolutely have a place in family histories because, we research the records because we're interested in the stories, right? And so a lot of times we allow the records to tell us a story. But how much better is that if we then also can sometimes find personal stories, whether that's in oral history, that's in an archive, or just, like in my case, these stories that my grandmother wrote down in a book that I was able to, then utilize to learn more about what her life is like, right? As a child, because I can find all the records that I want that say she was born in this place, she lived at this address in Jersey City, but the stories are what make it really interesting and what make those documents come to life.
Right.
Yeah, and those stories, I would imagine, can be helpful in guiding you as a genealogical professional towards where to look, maybe for records or other documents.
Absolutely.
To help
round out the picture.
To help round out the picture. Yeah. Now, speaking of stories, I understand there is a rich Venezia and stomping Jen story that kind of relates to your journey in becoming a professional genealogist. So I would love to hear it. Because I've only heard bits. I've heard bits and pieces over the year.
Should we do the rich version and then the Jen version?
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to hear the rich version.
Yes, please.
Oh man. So it has a huge impact on my story. So it's a really cool kind of closing the circle piece for me to be here on this podcast talking with you about my journey and my 7th year now of self-employment. So I lived back in the day in Northampton, and I worked in higher ed there for a little while. And, I'd always been interested in genealogy. I never really thought about doing it as a career. I did some informational interviews with some genealogists before I moved from New Jersey to Massachusetts and learned more about their experience, but, never really thought about the ability to do it full time. Everybody kind of said to me, it's really hard to make a living. A lot of people work part-time. A lot of people do this once they're retired or sort of as a second or third career, once they kind of have some money in the bank, it can afford to, try the freelance life. And, I enjoyed the work that I was doing, but I kind of just wasn't feeling as fulfilled as I would have liked. I was working long hours, the very kind of typical, I think, millennial story, right? Overworked, underpaid. And, I want to find a job that's meaningful. And so, I met Jen a tunnel bar. Is that what we met?
Some rando bar in Northampton.
At a bar in Northampton. And I was on a really bad date. No, that's a lie. It was
a first date.
I hadn't yet started the date. I think I got there early, which is not a thing I ever do, but I was there early and started chatting to Jen and your friend Jody, right?
Yes.
At the bar. And we got along really well. And they kind of said, hey, well, if the date goes south, let us know. And I think Jen gave me her number because they were, going dancing or something. And, flash forward, the date did not go well.
Oh, man.
And anyway, so, that was how Jen and I met. We then went dancing. And, we kept in touch during my time in Northampton. I think she could see that I was growing increasingly frustrated at the job that I was doing, and also that I was very passionate about the work that, I was doing a bit of side work in genealogy, and I joined some organizations and and try to take some classes and things to learn more about what being a professional would look like. And Jen really encouraged me, based upon her experience, to go for it and to see what it would look like, and to just kind of jump off the cliff, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that I remember saying, I think was like, you were wasting all this energy looking for a job you weren't really passionate about. And I'm like, if you could just divert that energy into looking for other jobs, into what you what you really want to be doing as a passion, like you could build your own career out of it.
Yeah.
And
I love that.
I guess it worked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because here he is.
That's amazing.
How many years later doing it full time, right?
I'm impressed with both of you on several levels. Like stomping Jen for being like, here's my number to somebody that she just met, and and then Rich, for you,
I think she could
calling
tell
her.
Well,
just both of you possess whatever that social skill set is. It's something I don't have, and I'm jealous of. So,
well, I think a lot of it was kismet. Like we learned, like he was from New Jersey, I'm from New Jersey. Like we shared a birthday. Like there was like some weird synergy happening that night. So
that's awesome.
For sure.
Yeah.
So, Rich, how do you then take that idea, that passion, and then translate it into reality? We're 7 years on, or I think you said 7 years on into your professional life as a genealogist now. Like, what are those initial steps look like? How do you make that plunge?
Gosh, a lot of being terrified, I think, is a big one.
Yeah.
I was really lucky. I was really young at the time still. I was in my mid-20s. And so I had the option and the opportunity to move back in with my parents. And so that was a huge safety net for me to first of all, be able to kind of not worry about the need to make a huge amount of money to pay a lot of bills for the first, about a year that I was working in my business. But also a lot of networking, a lot of meeting different people and understanding different experiences, and, seeing what other people were doing that was working, what other people were doing that wasn't working, and trying to find a niche in that, to see what was missing and what kind of gaps in the field could I fill, especially with things that I knew already or things that I was interested in. A lot of genealogists have subspecialties. And so the first while that I was in the field was really figuring out what I was interested in, what I was good at, and what was kind of missing that would allow for me to grow a sustainable business without kind of providing to people what there were already hundreds or thousands of other people, providing.
Yeah. Do you have a subspecialty or an area that you focus on?
Yeah, I do a lot of research in Italian records. I'm fluent in Italian, and so I do research in Italian records. And I travel to Italy to do research as well. I also do Irish research. I spent a good bit of time in Ireland. I lived there a bit in my 20s, and I studied there. And so, because of both of those things, I've been able to carve out, a kind of specialty in both Italian research and Irish research. But a kind of overarching specialty is immigration, specifically 20th century immigration. My field, when I entered it, I think it's safe to say was, had a big focus. Any focus on immigration was very colonial American immigration or early American immigration, and there's a lot of great researchers that have written books and treatises and spent lots of time doing research into early American immigrants and ancestors, but there was very little educational resources available in relation to more recent immigrants. Mm-hmm. And that was research I was doing. My family all came well after the Civil War. Most of my immigrant ancestors didn't, they came up till the early 1920s. Right. And, I think a part of that is because so much of genealogy is researching the past, right? Kind of the distant past. And so when the field really started becoming a field in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and really, throughout the second half of the 20th century, people were researching Mayflower ancestors. They were researching Revolutionary War ancestors. They started to research enslaved ancestors. But people that came over in 1910, 1920 were either still alive or their kids were still alive. And so thinking about it as a genealogical pursuit almost seemed kind of strange because it wasn't necessarily the distant past,
Yeah.
So I set about to learn a lot more about that and, work with some of the few people in the field that were doing that type of research to make sure that I was understanding as much as I could and figuring out what types of record sets weren't being used or, were really underutilized or really unknown to be able to then talk to people about those types of records and utilize those records in my research.
It's so interesting because, as you're talking, I think about Sawtooth's whole ancestry is Mayflower, off the boat, really old school America, and all of my ancestry is you're talking about, early 1900s.
But what's interesting about that, right, is something Rich is pointing out. I think we often have a blind spot towards our more recent immigrants in our families. I have a grandmother who immigrated from Sweden. That people often overlook that.
Yeah.
She was an immigrant.
I didn't overlook that.
Yeah, no, I know you didn't, but what I'm saying is you kind of immediately go back to
all the way to the Mayflower stuff.
And for me, I try to remind myself that all of us, no matter where we happen to be sitting, right, or for how long we've been sitting there, are immigrants and are descended from immigrants, right? And I feel like we forget this. Rich, having done this work for so long, do you have any insight into why this is something that we tend to forget? I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, I'd also first say just to, for a while, I was very, intent on this idea that we are all immigrants, right? And that there was even a hashtag about that. And I, especially, in the events of kind of the last 4 years, immigration has been really front and center. But I also think it's important to remember that, while most of us are descendant of immigrants, there are certainly some people that are full-blooded descendants of Native Americans and that, don't have any immigrant ancestors. And also, obviously, most, Black Americans have some ancestors that involuntarily immigrated, right? Against their will, they were enslaved. And so I think that's all part of the picture, right? In my field, I'd say it's pretty taboo to talk about, but, the pursuit of genealogy, I think, really grew with interest in joining societies, right? Daughters of the American Revolution, Sons of the American Revolution. There's Mayflower lineage societies. There's early colonial settlers and immigrant societies. Probably Massachusetts has some type of, early Massachusetts settler, type society. And, those societies and the descendants that, join those societies are could be considered a somewhat homogenous group, I suppose, right? And especially if we're talking, the people that were joining the DAR in the late 1800s, there's discussion and also some some factual stories about the idea of these societies in the first place was to promote and support homogeneity, right? America was becoming too not white. And so, certainly in my field, but I'd say more generally, when we think of, in my field, but because that's sort of that's the story that we tell. When we think about genealogy, we think about those types of things, right? We think about Mayflower ancestors. We think about colonial immigrant ancestors. We don't think about the people that came here 100 years ago. And I think that's in part because, there's not lineage societies where you get pins and medals and buttons, because your grandpa was an Italian immigrant. That's for folks that have been here for many, many generations. And I think there's a lot to be proud of when you're a descendant of both of those things. Mm-hmm. But I just think it's much less talked about, if you're a more recent, a descendant of more recent immigrants. I don't know if I necessarily have a good answer as to why that is. I just can certainly say that my field is no exception to that.
Mm. Yeah. Go ahead.
The other thing that strikes me as we were talking is like when you started talking about the oral histories and, written histories. And now we have this like age of technology where we have like recordings, like actual video, like this podcast that we do, our children can now like go back and they can hear what we were like. And, I don't know how long this will last, but there's like some new advancement in our, like, the recording of this genealogy field, right? Like that you can now tap into. I don't know what I'm saying. You're just like nodding your head. I'm just like, okay.
No, I mean, I think you're making a comment on the impact of technology on the field of genealogy,
yes,
right?
Thank you.
Are maybe more tangible, durable records, I think, potentially, depending on how those records are recorded and kept.
Well, we were just talking about that, like literally this weekend, about how photos are now kept in the cloud, and what happens if you forget to back them up, or like Sawtooth and I were talking. Well, if you had a fire and they were printed copies of photos, they would be lost as opposed to to digitized records. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's easier than ever to store things like records or recordings, but I also think it's easier than ever to lose them.
Yeah.
If you don't back them up properly, or if we've seen this throughout the government, with this idea of like data sets that are then deleted, right? Like what constitutes a record? If it's just an Excel database on someone's computer, or it's an email, does that count as a record? And the answer is in 2020, of course it does, but we don't necessarily think of that because we think of records as like paper, right? Or as photographs, or as something that's tactile. And there's so much more now that is a record that isn't tactile. And, whether willfully or accidentally, it's so easy to, store those improperly or delete them, or, have some type of accident that leads to their elimination, which makes it an exciting but also very precarious time to be, trying to keep records in those kind of formats.
And like one of the beautiful things that you do and other genealogists do, right, is you're able, you have the skills and the knowledge to be able to go out and look through these publicly available records, even private, maybe records that people are keeping, but they're like tangible physical things that you can put your hands on and have access to. And with digital files, I think that is going to make that much harder, right, for potentially for future genealogists to go through those records and try to make sense of them. I don't know.
Well, I was organizing this weekend, for instance, and I have only so many rooms in my house, and there's only so much stuff that you can have, right? There's only so many papers or photographs or boxes of things to go through, right? At some point, that's a finite end to that is reachable, even if it takes months and months or years and years, right? Whereas I was trying to clean up my computer the other day, and I was like, oh my gosh, like all these articles that I've downloaded that I never read, or all these photos that I got from emails, or various attachments, or, things that, somebody sent me 4 years ago that I was like, oh, I'll get to reading it. And now I have these things, and are they important? Are they not important? I don't know, because I don't remember the email that I got it in. But I kind of see it like that. You now have sort of endless opportunities for records and what counts as a record, and what's important, and what can it tell you. And so it is kind of I don't have an answer, but I think it could be difficult moving forward as to how to access that, or in some ways it might be very easy because you can, create a script to send the information from a database that you need that's specifically related to the person or the date or the time frame that you're interested in. But also what happens when there's a bug in the script, or when the computer crashes, or when that section of the cloud, goes down, or Amazon Web Services is down for the day or whatever, right? So it really is, I think it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah. Like the thing in my mind I think about is what happens if there's a solar flare or an EMP, and it comes and wipes all that stuff out, right?
Oh my God.
What will survive once everything is digitized? That's a question.
True.
But
who knows?
But like Rich is saying, there are, I think, some tangible benefits as it relates to genealogical work, using some of these modern tools. So kind of a big, zooming out a couple levels here, up a little higher. How does genealogical work broaden kind of our understanding of who we are, as contemporary people? Wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
I do. I actually did, subtle plug, I did a TEDx Pittsburgh talk a few years ago where I very broadly, I think, touched upon this subject, right? This idea of, what genealogy can teach us. And in the talk, I, discussed how I think genealogy can teach us empathy. And I think that one of the things that we really take for granted, right? You were talking before about, here we are sitting in this place today, right? And we're sitting in this place today because of the results of tens, likely hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of actions that we ourselves have taken, right? But we were in the place that we were born in and had our childhood in whatever places we had our childhood in, which led us to have certain experiences or meet certain people, or become interested in certain hobbies that led to a career because of the actions of other people, right? Because of our parents and their parents and their parents' parents. And you really think about that on a kind of macro level when you think about the immigrants that came to the United States, right? And how your life could be different, or would you even be you if your grandmother had never left Sweden, right? Or she'd left 20 years later. And so I think when you learn more about the people that came before you, it can be really instructive in learning more about yourself, right? Because you can really investigate how you got to be you through their stories, and some, there's of course these commercials on Ancestry that are like, oh, my grandma was a pianist and my mom was a flautist and now I'm a singer, and so it's in my genes or whatever, right? But, and that also is true, right? There's DNA today, and you can learn more about specific genes that promote specific traits. And it may be that you got some musical gene from your mom's 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 mom or whatever. But not everybody's going to be doing that type of high level DNA work. But I think a lot of people can appreciate, the basic stories of their ancestors, where they came from, why they came to that place. Was there chain migration? Were they farmers but had issues during the Dust Bowl, and that's why they ended up in Southern California by the 50s or something like that, or by the 30s or 40s or something like that. And I think when you really take those stories and appreciate them, you can have the opportunity to, gain a lot of empathy and understanding of other people's experiences. Especially recent immigrants or refugees or things like that, but even just to learn more about why other people are the way they are, right?
Yeah. And I watched your TED Talk, and I would recommend everybody go and watch it. We'll put a link to it in the show notes for the podcast so people can go see that. But you talk a little bit too about the benefits of understanding one's genealogy that can have on children. Like it has some tangible positive impacts on kids. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I have to say I am a bit less informed about this than I would like to be, but I did do a little bit of research into some of the studies that they were doing. And there was some really interesting research that was done down at Emory University. And, what had happened, they were, my understanding, again, is that it was 2001 and they were learning more about, children and their resilience and their feelings of self-worth, and what their family structure did to that, right? Like if they knew more about their family history, did they feel certain ways? Or if they felt more connected to their parents' childhoods, was that instructive to them? And then 9/11 happened. And so there was all of a sudden this national trauma for these kids that may not have necessarily known anybody that died, right? But we obviously all went through this horrific time together. And they went back to the same families and asked questions about, how they felt about certain things, about this tragedy, how they were overcoming it, what their family was doing together. And the very broad conclusion that they came to was that kids who knew more about their family history, who felt more connected to something that was bigger than themselves, handled trauma better. They felt more of a sense of self-worth and self-importance, and also that they were a part of this world, right? This place that was bigger than themselves. And it really started with, these building blocks of who are my parents and their parents, and where did they come from, and what are their stories, and, were their stories passed down of, well, when grandpa lost the farm, this is what we did to, this is what the family did to overcome that hardship. Yeah. Versus kids that didn't grow up with those types of stories and what that did, or what that lack of story kind of, did in the place of other kids who did grow up with those kinds of stories.
Yeah. I mean, or, grandma escaped the Armenian genocide, was able to go and rebuild, her life after that. And like, I know nothing so about the study or its findings, but like my sense is it might help give children, a sense that, bad stuff happens in the world. It happens to people. A lot of those people figure out how to recover and move on, and it may take a long time, but we figure out how to move on. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like as I listen to you, it's like the story of Judaism. It's so like rooted in a cultural history and like, hey, they tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat, that whole like culture.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, Rich, you mentioned DNA tests, and I had a question about that, right? Because in my mind, I feel like there are some people who might think, getting a DNA test is, getting a piece of your genealogy done. And that may be true. And you may have answered this, but I did want to ask you, what does the kind of genealogy work you do give us that a DNA test can't, right? And maybe
so much.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, so DNA is a super important tool. It's not a tool that I use very often. There are quite a few genealogists that specialize specifically within the DNA space. And you can learn, the amazing things that can be done with DNA in 2021, I guess now is, I mean, it's just breathtaking. You know, they are solving cold cases using DNA. People are figuring out who their biological parents are. People are figuring out that the person who they thought was their parent isn't their parent after all.
Oh, goodness.
And then figuring out who that actual parent was, you know. There's amazing things that can be done with DNA, but it's hard, you know. It's to really harness the full power of DNA testing for genealogical purposes. It is not as simple as, you know, the leaves that they show you on the Ancestry commercials, right? It's really, you know, getting your boots dirty, like research. And not only that, but also understanding of why, you know, what SNPs are, which is I don't even know what a SNP is. It's an SMP. It's like this term they use in DNA, and like triangulation and understanding like what it means if I'm related to these two people, but not those three people. And, you know, how much DNA we share in common, you know, makes us third cousins versus first cousins. And what does that even mean? And how does that apply to the research problem? You know, so there's all that said, but, you know, there's a lot of amazing work that can be done using DNA. I think for the normal kind of average person utilizing DNA, the most exciting thing that it tells you is your, you know, 45% Swedish and, you know, 55% Irish or whatever, you know. And those ethnicity admixture results, which they call them, are constantly changing, and they look slightly different depending upon which database you test with, you know. Because they each have different sample sets that they utilize to say, well, this is somebody that's 100% Southern Italian versus somebody that's 100% English or what have you. And so I think, you know, those results can be very informative, but they can also tell somebody that, you know, they're 0.0 or, you know, they're 0.5% Native American, and no document's ever going to confirm for you which ancestor that great grandmother that's a Native American was, you know. So I think it can be really informative, but you also, for DNA, you really need to know what your question is.
Right.
And kind of look into, well, how will my DNA help me to answer that question? And am I capable? Do I have, you know, the tools at my disposal to find the answer to that question, or do I need to utilize the help of, you know, folks on a Facebook group or something like that? But I think a lot of the true use of DNA is finding cousins that then have records, right? That then have answers. And, you know, you find the third cousin that's got a photo of that, you know, third great grandfather that you share or something like that. Or in that case, it'd be second great grandfather that you share. And that's cool. And that's interesting. But DNA only led you to that person, right?
Yeah.
It didn't give you that photo. It didn't show you which records to look at. It just confirmed, you know, that you're related to this other person, and this other person has also done some practical time doing research and putting that on the internet, or at least, you know, testing their DNA to find relatives so you could have this type of connection and share those types of family stories or documents.
So I'm hearing it can be an important tool in the genealogical toolbox, you know, and it can help somebody. It can help somebody avoid going down a rabbit hole, you know, thinking they were maybe related to somebody and doing months of research.
The lie detector test determined that was a lie.
That the DNA test could be the lie detector test.
It could also send you on a whole new rabbit hole. Though,
yeah,
you know, and that's the thing is that. It, you know, and again, there's also, like we talked about other things earlier, is a bit of a double-edged sword in that one.
Yeah. So one of the services you offer kind of as a professional genealogist is kind of what you describe as a genealogy consultation. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is? Like if I walked into your office or contacted you through the web and said, I would like a consultation, what does that look like?
Sure. So, I mean, we can use your grandmother, for example, right? So your grandmother's from Sweden.
Yep.
And like I said, I do a lot of research in immigration, specifically in 20th century immigration. And a lot of people that do immigrant research, will look for, a ship manifest. They'll look for citizenship paperwork, a naturalization document, and then kind of call it a day, right? They'll say, all right, well, found the immigrant, got their work and, their stuff for the U.S., they got their ship, they got their citizenship, and then, that's kind of the end of the story. And maybe you, look into doing their research back in Sweden, which is something that I cannot help you with. But, you might miss out on a lot of other documents. Or, in the case of specifically 20th century immigrants, what records you want to look for them are very dependent on when exactly they arrived. Did they become a citizen or did they not? Did they ever leave the country again? Did they apply for a passport? Did they leave the country while they were still an alien? Was that after a certain time frame? And that's all because the immigration laws changed very drastically in the 1920s with the immigration quota systems. And so that means there's a lot more records because they were really keeping track of who was coming in, how many people were coming in, where they were coming from. And so you have things like visa records and alien registration records and all other types of immigrant documents especially for more recent immigrants that you just don't have for folks that came over, from Ireland during the potato famine. There's just not the same types of records available. And it's really hard to wade through that. And also, in your case, if you're only researching one person, your grandmother, whereas everybody else, came over many, many, many generations beforehand, you might not necessarily want to spend, the 6 years that I've spent learning all this stuff and figuring out, well, what's an A file or what's a C file and what does it mean and how do I get it? And sometimes it's free and sometimes it's not. Where do I request those records from and how do I make sure that I get the thing that I'm seeking? And so, I offer consultations for those types of services as well as just for other people that are doing their own genealogical research and, hit a roadblock and want to talk through that. But I'm really passionate about, specifically helping folks find the records related to their immigrant ancestors, because there can be some really rich and interesting files, with photographs and with signatures and with family stories and documents, because immigration became so much more restrictive and so much more documented, starting in the early 1900s.
It's fascinating. And in fact, I think I remember seeing something like a ship manifest or something from my grandfather, who was married to my grandmother who immigrated, was a merchant marine, and that's how he met.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's how he met her. And I believe I remember seeing like some kind of ship manifest at some point or something from when she came over, like some kind of document. Yeah. Like I know my father has that in a cardboard box, like sitting in his basement somewhere. It's really interesting. Yeah.
There'd probably be some really interesting records for your grandfather, who was a merchant marine as well.
Yeah. And that's a whole story. Like he died at sea. He was,
wow.
Yeah, he was interred at sea. Like there's all sorts of stuff.
There's
I think
a story there
that documents all of that. But and you also do more complex genealogical work, right? I was looking on your website, and it describes it as genealogical research analysis. Can you talk a little bit about that work that you do and who might be interested in that?
Sure. Yeah. I do all types of different genealogical research, from questions like, I don't know anything about my family history, help me go, to I have this really specific research problem. I've always known that my grandfather's father was Italian, and it's always been really important to us that we identify as Italian, but we don't know where in Italy he's from. Or I heard some family story about, my great uncle that went missing from the family, or that, committed a crime or went back to Italy, and we always wanted to know why. Those kinds of specific questions. So I can help folks utilizing the different databases and resources that I use and that I know about to find the answers to those questions. And each one is really interesting, and I kind of enjoy the specific analyses as much as I do the kind of broader genealogical research trees. There's a lot, I think. There's a lot to be learned in both types of scenarios, and I think that helping people close that gap for a decades-old mystery of the family is just as satisfying as introducing people to this entire family that they never knew about. And so it's really interesting and it's really exciting, and I feel really privileged to be able to help reconnect people to their ancestors, and also to help them find the answers to some of these long-standing family mysteries or family stories.
Without asking you to reveal specific clients, would companies come to you? Like if there's a company that has a question, maybe that needs a really deep dive on research, or a university or something, or even some other type of entity. Would you work with those types of clients?
Yeah, absolutely. The types of questions that people ask, I think, whether it's we want to learn the history of this company, or we want to learn more about this company's founder and how he came to, do what he did, or buy the land that the headquarters is now standing on, or something like that. It's all within the purview of the type of work that genealogists do, right? We look into old newspapers, we look into, building records and deed records and estate records and all sorts of different things that can help, answer various types of questions from various audiences. I don't know too many genealogists that do historical research for movies, for instance, but we could definitely use those same types of resources to figure out, everything from what was the typical weather like on a, May day in 1850s England to, what types of things would be served at a presidential banquet in the 1940s. Most genealogists that are worth their salt would be able to help answer those types of questions just because of the different resources that we utilize on a daily basis, usually to help folks find the stories of their ancestors, but certainly not just limited to that, specific, that specific request, I suppose.
That's really interesting. Another area you focus on, and you mentioned this earlier, was around helping people obtain dual citizenship. So now, I guess a question I had was, if you, and you focus, I think you said, on Ireland and Italy, if you have ancestry in either of those countries, do people have some sort of claim on citizenship?
Yeah, so in the U.S., I think sometimes find it hard to conceptualize because birthright citizenship has been the U.S. kind of MO since, theoretically since the, the 14th Amendment right after the Civil War. But really since 1924, which is when all Native Americans that were born on U.S. soil were considered U.S. citizens. But we have this idea that if you're born in the U.S., you're a citizen. And in fact, most countries in the world are not what are considered birthright or jus soli countries. They're jus sanguinis countries. And a lot of European countries specifically are blood right countries. And so it doesn't matter where you're born. It depends. It matters the nationality of your parents when you're born there. And so even to this day, for instance, if you're born in Italy, but your parents are, let's say, refugees from Africa, you are not automatically an Italian citizen. You have the right to request citizenship once you're 18, if you've gone through the school system, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of countries don't have that same type of citizenship law that we have. And so because of that, a lot of Americans, or hyphenated Americans, Irish Americans, or Italian Americans, can lay claim to ancestral citizenship provided that certain stipulations are met. A lot of European countries do have some type of ancestral citizenship, but how many generations it goes down to, and also what stipulations might be met, vary greatly depending upon which country it is. And so, for instance, like in Ireland, if your grandparent was born in Ireland, you can request Irish citizenship, and it's actually a pretty straightforward process. Italy is a bit more complicated. It depends upon when your ancestor immigrated, where exactly in Italy they immigrated from, and most importantly, when they became a U.S. citizen, if ever. But there are millions of Italian Americans around the U.S. Who are unaware that they actually have a right to request that their Italian citizenship be recognized based upon those principles. So I help folks with determining eligibility and also then gathering all of the proper documentation necessary to make that formal request for citizenship.
So, do you hear this, people? You need to
hope is not lost.
No, you need to contact Rich. You might have a ticket out of here.
I know, right? We've said that to ourselves, I think, this last year many, many times. Where else could we go?
Yeah. Wow, that is so fascinating.
It's great. I mean, I will say that, 10, 20 years ago, it was not a very known entity, and now a lot of people are copping on. And so there's huge wait times at consulates. They have several years to process applications, and so it's by no means a quick fix. But, I always tell people if they're interested or they think they might be eligible for citizenship, it's always just good to know if you can get it. And then if you are eligible but don't have an immediate, need or desire to get out of here, start the process now, because it very well could be 3, 4, 5 years from when you start the process of gathering your documentation to when you have that passport in your hand.
Yeah, and if those people are considering something like that, another thing you help people with, right? And if you probably want to visit a country, you want to have citizenship in. You help people plan what you call heritage tours. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's something I love to do, and don't get too many people to take me up on it, but I also it is, the year of COVID, right? So not too many people are going to their ancestral homelands, but I spent the past decade going to different places where my family's from, in Ireland and in Italy, and seeing these little villages and meeting local townspeople and learning more about where my family lived, and walking in the footsteps of the places where, where my family was. And even here, where I live in Pittsburgh, some of my Italian family came to an area outside of Pittsburgh. I still have relatives out here. And so I go to, the town that they lived in. I go to the cemetery and look into, my ancestors' gravestones. I've gone and visited the house in which my grandfather was born before his family moved over to New Jersey. And so, I think there's something really valuable in that, right? People do research and want to know more about where their family's from. But a lot of times it's, taking it to another level is to then go visit those places, to see those villages, or cities, depending upon where they came from. And, to see the house where, some relative they knew was born, or to walk from, their section of town to the market or to the church or to the town hall. Because it really helps those people's stories, come alive. And, how you want to approach that obviously looks very different from person to person, and looks different, whether you're in a very developed part of northern Italy or a very underdeveloped part of southern Italy, for instance. But I think that there's a lot of value in going back to the places where your family came from and seeing them. And so I love to help people, get into some of those specifics. And sometimes they want to do research in the town hall or in the church, and other times they just want to go see the places and, need help finding a local guide, or a translator or something like that. But my parents have been talking about it for years, so I'm hoping in the next couple of years I'll get to go with them to be able to show them some of the places that I've been able to see.
Yeah, I almost certainly would want to do something like that.
Well, you talk about going to Scotland all the time.
Yeah, I mean, my Scottish ancestry is more mythological at this point, like unconfirmed, right? And that's the beauty of what somebody like Rich does and the service that he provides. Like I could go to Rich and say, could you help me, figure this out?
Right. Am I actually Scottish?
And part of it is like, yeah, I'm interested in that, but I also don't want to dispel the myth either that I'm just descended from Highlanders.
He wants to be a Viking as long as possible.
Well, Vikings and Highlanders are different.
I understand.
Okay.
I'm just... all right.
Yeah, anyways. Okay, fine. Let's see.
It is funny, though. People that are interested in researching their family history, especially if they have specific questions, need to be very, they need to be ready to find some skeletons in the closet. One thing that I love about the research that I do is that you find that people are people, right? People were, getting married on a Sunday and having a baby on a Wednesday 200 years ago too. It was like things like affairs or people committing crimes or, people, doing things that are sacrilegious or blasphemous, right? Like all these are things that people have done for eons, right? That is not something that's new to modern society. And so I think people always need to be cognizant of you do some research into your family, but you always think one thing and that story may not be the truth. Now, 8, 9 times out of 10, it usually is, right? But every now and again, you spit into a tube and you think, your daddy's your daddy. And then you realize, oh, my dad actually was the postman. It sounds crazy, but it's happening to people all the time nowadays because of the advent of the usage of DNA. And even just, when looking through old documents and things like that. And so it really, doing this research also has the potential to be really life altering and not always in a positive way.
Yeah.
And I don't think people always recognize the potential for that. Yeah.
So there are emotional risks, right, that you're undertaking in doing this. And to Rich's point, you have to be prepared for that. How have you, again, without asking you to reveal details, have you encountered a pretty hefty situation where you had to be like, all right, sit down. And here's the document that demonstrates this maybe not so great thing.
Don't shoot the messenger.
Yeah. And what's that moment like for you as a professional?
Well, so I've had some interesting experiences over the years. I found people that have committed suicide. I found people whose ancestors were raped or committed a rape. Things that can be really devastating, especially if, the people who you're researching were close to you. I think a lot of people also don't want their ancestors to have been slaveholders, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot at play here. I think one of them being, a thing that's being talked a lot about nowadays, especially with, the events of 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement, of the idea that we're not responsible for the actions of our forefathers and of our ancestors, but we certainly can stand to benefit from them and perhaps have benefited from the privilege that their decisions, made, or the privilege that their decisions, have led to. And, likewise, also, the trauma that, some ancestor 100 years ago faced that then led to alcoholism, that then led to your, grandparent being brought up in this, really troubled childhood or what have you. I think a lot of genealogists don't appreciate that they sometimes have to be psychologists too. I had one personal circumstance where I was doing research, and this is again where I had the thought of finding this type of information was the furthest thing from my mind when I ordered my grandfather's naval service record. I was just hoping to get, different information about his time in the Navy, where exactly he served. We confirmed that he served. He was indeed at D-Day. And there was also this letter in there from his fiance, who was not my grandma.
Oh, no.
And I was really shocked at that. And also was like, what do I do with this information? Because I was getting this from my mom for like a Christmas gift. And so I gave her the documents. And then a couple of days later after Christmas, I had an envelope with the other pages that were this woman's letter. And I asked my mom, I said, I've talked about this before, but I just want to be certain, like, when I do research into your family, like, you're interested in learning everything about them, right? Like, regardless of who it is, regardless of what I find. And, she confirmed that she had. I asked her this, previously through some, surreptitious means about other people. And so I gave her the envelope with the documents, and I expected her to be a lot more surprised than she was. I think my mom is really realistic because I tell her about some of the work that I do. And so she just knows that sometimes you find the craziest stuff. But her reaction was really, I'd say, almost muted. She kind of said, well, it was the 40s. A lot of people were getting engaged before they left because they wanted somebody to write home to. They wanted to be able to, have a light at the end of the tunnel and something to look forward to, And so, she said, it didn't surprise her and also didn't upset her. But I think it equally could have been very shocking and surprising and upsetting to somebody to find out that type of information. So in my mom's case, I thankfully didn't have to, play therapist too much. But there are certainly times when people, when I find information and that's problematic or troublesome, and ethically, it's not my place to withhold information from the clients.
Right.
I mean, they're paying me to do the research. And so, sometimes I'll put a bit of a disclaimer in the email to them with, the report, or put that in a separate thing. So they're like, they know that it's there, but if they want to share it with their kids or something, that they don't, find out that great grandpa was in prison for rape or whatever, and for the most part, I've actually had pretty, positive experience and feedback about, handling those things delicately, and allowing people to sort of look through the information, digest it on their own. They ask questions if they need to, and kind of just accept that, well, that was a thing that happened in my family, and, we learn from it and move on. And every now and again, people will say, oh, well, that person was a real jerk anyway. So it's like, whatever bad thing they did is like, wow, it just fits in with, the stories that we that we knew about them.
Yeah. I mean, and I think so often when we think about our ancestors, right, even the people like on the Mayflower or whatever, we don't think of them as the people who were involved in the same day-to-day struggles that we all are, like around,
right.
Our ancestors,
around
they're people too.
Commitments, that they had, hopes and dreams that, they didn't like this particular person. Like, I think it takes people from being like a branch on a paper family tree to like actual human beings.
Yeah.
I mean, and of course, like Rich, like you're saying, I mean, that may not in some cases always be the easiest thing to have to learn, or the easiest message to have to internalize about somebody you're related to a few generations ago. But I find that fascinating. Let's see. So we mentioned your TED Talk before, which I want people to go and watch who are listening to this. And you do a lot of lecture work. And I have to say you were awesome in your TED Talk. And I have to confess, I've always secretly fantasized about doing a TED Talk. So could you just talk a little bit about, I think, lecturing, what kind of lectures you offer.
Sure.
And I'm also interested, to the extent you're comfortable talking about your TED Talk experience and what that was like.
Sure. I get the TED Talk question a lot. It's so funny that, how many people have seen it since and asked questions about it. I studied theater, so my natural inclination is to be a goofball standing up in front of people, saying lots of crazy stuff. And so I think I'm very well suited to lecturing, which I didn't really realize at the beginning of my career. I didn't start lecturing until kind of a little bit into my time as a genealogist. But, some of the work that we do and some of the research the slog of the research that we need to do can be super dry, right? Can be super boring, but it's important. The process is what gets you the results, right? It's very seldom as simple as typing it into a database and finding a great record, right? It happens, but it's not often, it's certainly not the way to do kind of good research. And, I lecture a lot about the topics that we've been talking about, right? About immigration, about naturalization, about underutilized federal records for 20th century immigrants, about Italian research, about Irish research. There's lots of genealogical conferences around the country throughout the year. Of course, in 2020, most of them became virtual, but I have great opportunity to go all over the country to talk about these types of things at various conferences, or sometimes I'll do day-long seminars at libraries. Almost every county in the country has their own genealogical society. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of counties will also, have their own kind of genealogy seminar once a year, and they'll bring in some nationally known speaker. And so I've been lucky enough to, have the opportunity to do a few of those. As for the TED Talk, I had always wanted to do one. I kind of felt that I had something interesting to say. And then I kept an eye on the TEDx Pittsburgh page, and it was really as simple as seeing that there was, they were accepting submissions and doing up a little video, and then they accepted me. And then, we workshopped it a little bit, a few times. They highly recommend we read the Chris Anderson TED book, which I found really helpful and really interesting. Not everyone is confident or comfortable with public speaking. And I found that, for me, that wasn't as much of a problem just because of my background as an actor. But I found that, studying other people's TED Talks that you admire, can be really helpful, because I think there's a certain cadence to good TED Talks. And that's not really something that can be taught. It's kind of just something that you can really witness and try to internalize. I had a funny experience with TEDx, because I was traveling, and, I checked in every now and again on the Pacer website to see when they were accepting submissions. And I usually checked once every few days. Of course, there was a period of time where I didn't check for like 3 weeks, because I was traveling, I was teaching in a workshop, I was researching in a library, and so I was like away out of town for several weeks. And then I looked, one Monday, and I saw they'd opened up submissions in the meanwhile, and it was due the next day.
Oh, no.
So that actually was what wound up happening, is that I stopped everything I was doing, created a little script, made a video. And the next day when I submitted it, they then extended the deadline.
Of course. Of course they did.
Did you end up using the one you recorded at the last minute?
Well, so that was kind of a quick 2 to 3 minute intro to your idea, but it wasn't the whole thing
yeah.
kind of, blown out. So I utilized a lot of the same ideas, but the script obviously changed over time. I'm just really I think that, if you don't have necessarily a huge theater background or something like that type of experience, may not lead to
Yeah.
the positive outcome it did for me. And I'm really fortunate for that. But, I'd say if people are interested in doing TEDx talks, see where there are local ones. And a lot of times, especially if you live, in an even remotely urban area, there's, the city often does one, and there's sometimes one in the suburbs and sometimes one in the local university. And you don't always have to be a university student to do it. There might be lots of good and interesting opportunities for folks to try one out.
They do one up here.
So, Rich, did you say you studied theater in college?
I did, yeah. I have a Bachelor's of Arts in theater arts with a concentration in acting. Yeah.
I cannot help make the connection between actors study people, right? And you're a genealogist and you study people. Do you see a connection?
I've never thought of that.
Do you see a connection there?
Yeah, I mean, good actors do a lot of research, right? I mean, you listen to, big Hollywood actors talk about the routines that they do and the research that they do for a big role, especially if, the role is based on someone that was a real person. I never thought about it that way, to be honest.
Oh,
that's a really interesting connection.
Sawtooth making connections.
I can't help but think that there has to be, right? In some way.
Yeah, it totally follows.
Yeah.
Just haven't. I always thought why I always loved theater was because, and I still love theater. I haven't acted in years at this point, but I always thought that an actor's job was to find the truth in a character, right? I think that there's this common misconception that actors lie, right? That they spend their lives faking because they're just always pretending to be other people. And I think, a true artist would say like, well, actually, really, it's our job to find truth in imaginary circumstances, right? In a fictionalized circumstance. And in a way, that's what I do in my research, right? Yeah. I find the truths of family stories, which have often been, mangled or confused over the years. What a neat thread.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, sure. So, I want you to talk a little bit about your Meet My Immigrants hashtag / project.
Yeah.
Is that an active project you have going on?
It is not. Okay. Gosh, maybe I'll get back to it. There's actually still like 2 or 3 people that I haven't yet written about. I try my best to, oh gosh, here I am, like not being able to say. I try my best to not talk too much about politics in my professional life. Certainly at conferences and things like that, we're obviously very apolitical. And it's hard sometimes because I talk about immigrants, right? I talk about recent immigrants and understanding the restrictions that immigrants into the United States, what that's looked like over the past 100 years is really informative to the discussions that we have today about immigrants and who can come in and who can't come in and what that looks like. And so basically, the short story is, in this same trip that I was just talking about when I had to put together this TEDx submission video in a hot second, it was also right when Trump was inaugurated and he enacted the Muslim travel ban.
Yeah.
And, I felt very personally affronted by that, because so many of my ancestors were recent immigrants, and what I talk about and what I teach and what I'm interested in is the stories of recent immigrants. And especially for someone whose mother, was a 20th century immigrant, and his grandparents on his other side were 20th century immigrants. I felt like there was a real disconnection between that family history and the rhetoric regarding that. And so, I thought in my little way I could, start a conversation about immigrant ancestors that, make me the person that I am today. And so every day for about a month after the travel ban was enacted, I introduced folks through my social media channels to various immigrant ancestors of mine. And if I had photos of them, I would share photos or interesting document, interesting story, and use the hashtag Meet My Immigrants, and encouraged other people to do that. I have to confess that it didn't quite catch on as a wildfire like I'd hoped it would. But it did, cause some folks in my community and in the genealogical field to take part and to learn more about their immigrants and to, encourage others to do the same. And so it was a project I was really proud of. I don't know how I found an hour and a half every day in that month to figure that out, and that's kind of unfortunately one of the reasons why it fizzled, just because, you run out of time to do things that you're not getting paid to do. You know?
I mean, I think it's a really beautiful thing, and I think it's an important thing for us all to think about, right? And I said this a little bit earlier in our conversation, like we're all immigrants, right? I mean, even our Native American population on this continent came over the land bridge at one point, right? That was tens of thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. But and I think it's an important exercise for people to go through, especially when the politicians of the day are focusing on whoever the contemporary immigrant target population happens to be. It was the Irish in the 1800s and early 1900s, Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants in World War II. I mean, my grandmother told me this horrifying story about how they used to go down to the American Japanese internment camps and throw rocks at the Japanese prisoners.
Oh my gosh.
I was like, what?
Yeah.
No.
Many of whom were American born, you know? I mean, you were interned whether you were Japanese born or Japanese American.
Absolutely. But, I was doing a high school research project and interviewing her, and she just kind of very cavalierly revealed this to me. And I don't love my grandmother any less for it, but it was an important lesson for me in trying to understand people in places and times, right? Like, where am I going with this stumping, Jen? I got lost. So anyways, so now I know. So I think, I think it is a really wonderful project, and I think we all could do better, in trying to connect to our immigrant roots, no matter how hard that connection might be for any one of us, right? Yeah. It's an important exercise to go through, I think, anyways.
I recall this beautiful artwork that was outside of the Maine College of Art, maybe in Portland, when I was there a few years ago, and it said every refugee boat is a Mayflower, and I think that sentiment really speaks to me. There's a lot of misinformed people these days that spout this idea of, well, my immigrant ancestors did it the right way, or they did it legally, without really recognizing that up till 100 years ago, all you needed was the money to get on a boat. I mean, now granted, starting in the 1870s, there were exclusions relating to Chinese, and then later Japanese and all Asian individuals. But really, up till 1917, most anybody from most anywhere in the world, if you could afford to get on a boat and didn't have tuberculosis or trachoma, you could come on over and get in. And so, utilizing that idea of, legal immigration doesn't really follow when you think of what legal immigration looked like then versus what legal immigration looked like throughout the 20th century versus what legal immigration looks like today in 2021. And so, putting those same guidelines up, it doesn't really follow, right?
It's like
very,
apples and oranges, right? It's like,
right. It's just a whole different, it's a whole different situation. And that's why I encourage people to learn more of the stories, right? Because then if you learn why your ancestors came over on the Mayflower, well, that's very similar to why people are, you know, leaving war-torn countries, or why, you know, certain, you know, religious minorities are refugees in droves to other places. You know, the time has changed. The year is different, but the reason for migration, you know, there's absolutely a common thread there going back centuries, you know?
Yeah. So thinking about kind of how you do this genealogy work, in my mind, I envision this to actually be quite physical work. You're walking through buildings, going into basements, climbing book stacks, sitting underneath microfiche machines, lifting boxes. You know, I don't know. In my mind, I actually see it as physical work. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to physically do this work, and if it takes a toll?
You know, I have to admit that it's a lot less Indiana Jones than that, I think, which is unfortunate, because that really sounds great.
I romanticize everything and everyone. So,
you know, I have a standing desk. I stand at my computer most of the day. You know, I do a lot of research online, or if I'm going to go do research in an archive, it involves a lot of prep work on my computer in advance. You know, researching at an archive looks different from archives to archives. You know, sometimes you are lifting the boxes and grabbing the records and looking through the books yourself. Other times, you know, at the National Archives in DC, for instance, or College Park, Maryland, you fill out poll slips and they then provide you with the records, and you're seated at a desk, and there are very specific rules as to what you can and can't do, and how you can and can't, you know, reproduce or photograph things. So, you know, I'd say that physically, it's just every day looks very different. Obviously, 2020 has looked very much the same, because it's standing at home at my computer. But in a normal time, you know, one day I'm at my computer, at my desk. Another day I'm traipsing through a cemetery. Another day I'm going to some archives. Another day I'm flying on a plane to go to some conference to talk about, you know, this, that, the other thing. You know, and so it's, I think, a little less physical than you're imagining, but also I find it very exciting, because the days all look very different depending upon the research that I'm doing, the projects that I'm working on, you know, or the specific archives in which I need to go investigate. And that's really nice, because I already love the work that I do, but it also means that I am not, you know, sitting in the same office chair every day from 9 to 5 doing the exact same thing. And that's very well suited to, you know, to my personality and how I best function.
7 years into this now, what has surprised you? What has surprised you about being a professional genealogist?
Gosh, you promised me there wouldn't be any gotcha questions.
Sorry. I didn't have that one written down either. Sorry.
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I'm constantly amazed. If I may toot my own horn for a second here, I would say that I'm widely respected in my field as one of the foremost, if not the foremost, expert on the topics that I research, specifically in regards to 20th century immigration. There are a few other people that I collaborate with frequently who aren't professional genealogists that I would say other people are also aware of, who would, you know, be considered at a higher caliber of knowledge than I have. But a lot of people across the field know me and respect me, and ask me loads of questions about this weird, hard immigrant problem. I'm like, what happens if, you know, this person was born overseas, but their mom was American, but their dad wasn't. Like, what does that mean? And what's their citizenship status? And what type of records might exist, right? For example. And I love that, and I relish that because I've spent a lot of time learning those things. But I'm also constantly amazed at what I don't know. I'm constantly amazed at what I thought I knew that I don't know, and what I, how much learning there still is to do. I'm going to be 31 in a couple weeks, and and I'm so grateful that I came to this career so early, because I feel like I've got decades left of learning to do. There's so many books that I want to read, and there's so much, there's so much immigration history that I want to understand. There's so much policy that I want to learn. There's so many record sets that I want to look at. There's so many if-then scenarios that I have yet to think of, or that have yet to be brought to my attention, but that I want to be able to figure out. And so I'm constantly surprised, and I think humbled by, by the amount of learning that I have left to do, and that I still want to do. I think, being an expert is fun and all, but I think it's also just as fun to continue, to learn, and to continue to innovate, and to continue to, explore, different options and scenarios, and records and then laws. And so, I'm grateful, like I said, to have come to this at the age that I did, because I feel like I still have so much left to learn, and then to be able to impart to other people through the teaching that I do.
Yeah, that is awesome.
That's a great answer.
Yeah. All right. So a non-genealogy related question. What do you like?
Color's blue.
Mine is purple, by the way. I love purple. Although I just got a blue iPhone. That's
because they didn't make it in purple.
They did not have a purple iPhone.
Oh, I also just got a blue iPhone. Are we iPhone twins?
I think so. See, Jen, Rich and I have something in common too.
That's great.
No, what I wanted to ask you, when you're not doing your work, what do you like to do for fun?
I do genealogy for fun. That's actually very true. So many genealogists come to the field, not because it's like a common vocation, but it's because we like to do it, and then realize like, oh, people will pay us to do this? That's cool. Yeah. But I love to travel. I have been very fortunate to be able to live and to work abroad for a while in my early 20s. I backpacked. I love to travel, to see new places, to experience new cultures, and eat new and interesting foods. I love to read. I also I do country western line dancing and two-stepping, which is
that I did not expect those words to come out of your face. That's awesome.
Yeah, I love it. This year's been super tough because I had a great community of people here in Pittsburgh that I adored, who we saw on a weekly basis, and we had the monthly hoedowns, and it was great. And obviously, that's social dancing is like one thing that will take a long time to resume, I think.
Yeah. That's great. All right, last question, and we ask this of all of our guests. Stomping Jen.
Here we go.
Yep.
Yeah.
What have you seen? And you can take this any way you like. What have you seen that you cannot explain?
Oh, there it goes.
Oh, man.
Rich is thinking.
It's such a ridiculous question.
What a question.
I know, right?
Man, I wish I'd had an hour and a half to think about this answer.
Sorry.
What have I seen that I can't explain? Well, we're talking about genealogy, right? And so I'm gonna circle it back to work.
That's okay.
Something I will never understand is how many people treat like ancestry family trees as the Bible. And so like, for instance, you input information into a tree, right? And then somebody else sees it and they're like, oh, that's all true. And I'll add it to my tree. And so I have seen so many trees of people that were like born in 1760, but they died in 1914 and they had 27 children across 20 states. And it's just like, bad information begetting bad information to people that are not checking their work. But it's just something that is so prevalent in my field. I mean, we talk about it at every conference, right? We always make jokes about it. But it is kind of crazy, like how many people kind of just have this interest in genealogy, but have no interest whatsoever in like really checking that work and verifying the information, and even just doing like a quick like dummy check to make sure that, oh, this woman was not having a child when she was 4 years old. Like, that's just physically not possible.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And that is why we need genealogy professionals.
Right. We don't need alternative facts out there.
Thank you. Sorry for the surprise question, but thank you for answering it.
All good.
All right. Before we go, is there anything you want to tell us? Anything you want to plug? Any final points you want to make about being a genealogist? I mean, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm sure you'll plug, I'm sure my website and things like that will be in the show notes and what have you.
Yep.
One of the most valuable things that I've been able to do in my professional career, especially over the last year and a half, is I worked on this records access advocacy campaign. And it's kind of a long story, but the short of it is the government agency that handles immigration also has records, and they wanted to raise the fees on their records because they were raising fees on all things within their purview, including naturalization and visas and things like that. And so I gathered together a bunch of other records access advocates to fight against that. We got a lot of really good press and talked to some interesting people. Ultimately, the fees were raised less than we anticipated, but then there was a court injunction, so now the fees are currently on hold. But through that process, I learned a lot about records access advocacy and how often there are things like public comment periods that nobody knows about, that nobody knows where to look for. And a lot of people, I think there's this weird thing in the world we live in now where everything is digital, where like people love to be outraged, right? But they often have very misdirected outrage. And so in the genealogy world, I think, we often will see a law after it's passed that restricts access to vital records, for instance. There's a big one in Massachusetts that I want to mention in a second. But we weren't there for the process, right? Like we missed the boat on the ability to comment, right? To get our members of Congress involved, to get our local legislators involved, to call the town select person, right? And say, hey, I've got this problem. And so I've heard about this new law, like I really oppose it. How can we, get the word out or what have you? And so that was really eye-opening for me. And that's something that I want to work on much more in 2021 than I did in 2020, to further that idea in my field of, the importance of the awareness of these types of comment periods or, public ability to shape the laws, right? I think a lot of people are very disenchanted with politics these days and they feel like they can't make a difference. But at least in terms of, access to historical records and things like that, so many of the records that we deal with are created and disseminated by public agencies, which means there has to be public input, which means there has to be public accountability. And so there's all of these opportunities to do that, that I think my field especially, but I think this goes for any type of anything, right? We really missed the boat on the ability. And so it's so important to be really in tune with like, what laws is your town passing? Whether it's for vital records or like who's salt in the streets. You know what I mean? Like any of those types of things often have the opportunity to have public comment. And it's so not useful to be enraged once the thing is settled, but certainly if you have the opportunity to be involved, at an earlier process and make your voice heard, even if the outcome isn't the outcome you want, you can still have been involved in that process. And this really played out in this law that I was mentioning in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Genealogical Council does a great job of making people aware of these types of proposed laws or changes to legislation. Humble brag, they awarded me with their Records Access Award this year.
Oh my God, hold on.
But so in Massachusetts for centuries, Massachusetts has been an open record state. And so birth, marriage, and death records, which in some states are very restricted for many decades after they're created. In Massachusetts, if you know the information about the event, you can go and get the record. And certainly people may have opinions about that, but that's what the law has been in Massachusetts since colonial days, really. That, the records of birth, marriages, and deaths were, town events that were public knowledge, that were public events, and the records themselves that were created were public. And the governor last year, I believe, either early last year or late 2019, introduced legislation to close the to close the records to a more like time frame that would be more in line with a lot of other states.
Charlie Baker.
Charlie.
Indeed.
That was for you, Baker. Okay, go ahead.
I don't know anything about Charlie Baker other than this law, but
that was all Sawtooth directing my wrath at Charlie Baker.
Charlie.
Yep.
But anyway, so because they organized this campaign and they had people write in and they had people write to their local representatives, the law wasn't passed, or that specific addition to the law didn't make it into the final version. And so I think it's just one of those things that goes to show you that if enough people have a say about a thing, maybe that thing doesn't happen, or maybe, that change isn't enacted because there's enough people that put the time and energy into writing a letter.
Yeah. That's awesome. And thank you for your work on that. I mean, we benefited from that right here, Stomping Jen.
Yeah. I want to echo.
I didn't work on the Massachusetts one, but I worked on the national one.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Anyway, just wanted to clarify that.
Yep. Thanks.
Sorry, Jen.
No, you're fine. I just want to echo, yes, don't wait till things happen. And so many times people get enraged about something that was passed where they had a full process along the way if they had just paid attention to. At any point in the process, they could have interjected or made their point clear. And so many times people wait until it affects them, and then they get their panties up in a bunch.
And I also think,
we didn't get that information. Well, there was this public meeting and this public hearing and these meetings along the way.
Yeah, and I think that goes to we all could do a little better in trying to understand how our civic structures operate, right?
Totally agree.
It's really important.
Agreed.
Really important.
Don't wait for the issues to affect you directly.
Yeah.
Pay attention, volunteer, get involved.
Yeah.
Read the paper. So many people think that the local paper is useless.
Yeah. And if you have a
my gosh, the local paper is the best source of news.
Yeah. Local papers. And if you have a question, right?
Call your select board member.
No. If you have a question about maybe how you connect to the history of your town, or if you have questions about your own personal history, we're going to call somebody like Rich, and we're going to call Rich first.
Yeah.
Venezia. Rich Venezia.
Rich Roots
at
Genealogy.
Rich Roots Genealogy. That's who we're going to call first.
Not the Ghostbusters.
Right. We're going to call Rich. So if you have questions about genealogy, that's who we're calling. Okay?
Yes.
All right. Rich Venezia. Nationally recognized.
Say that all night now.
Nationally recognized genealogist. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I learned a ton from our conversation. I had a lot of fun talking to you.
Me too. Thank you.
Stomping Jen,
Yeah.
anything you'd like to say?
Thank you. It's so nice to see you.
It is. It's so great to see you too.
I know. It's crazy.
Our listeners, I have a message for you.
Oh, okay. Listeners.
Thank you for listening. I love you. Please, if you are enjoying what you're hearing from us here at the Soft Serve Podcast,
Yes.
please subscribe, download,
share with a friend,
leave a review
share it,
on Apple Podcasts for us. That helps us.
spread the word.
Right? Spread the word, please.
Yeah.
We have a lot of great stuff coming
Yeah.
up.
We do.
Okay? We're going to continue our hot streak.
Yeah. So be safe.
Be safe out there.
Wear a mask.
Wear a mask.
Get vaccinated.
Yep, that. If
Whenever
you
it's available.
don't cut anyone in line, though, Stomping Jen.
No.
That's important. Wait your turn to get vaccinated, but be safe. And so we'll see you, right?
Yeah.
Rich, do you want to say goodbye?
Thanks so much. I had a great time. It's great to be here.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thanks. All right.
All right, people.
Everybody.
Bye now.
Take care. Bye now.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate. Those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibility. That all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the sources, scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth. And that in the goodness of time, all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed